quality mics as suggested by our audio man, Tim Dobbs.
Yeah, I don't have quality mics, so I'm recording this on my my Apple earpods.
Well, I give seminars on podcasting, and one of the things I tell people is that good technique with okay equipment is actually better than bad technique on superior equipment.
Makes a lot of sense. What counts as good technique for podcasting?
Really, it's just if you're on your like lapel mic, you don't have long hair, but when we have guests who have long hair, if their hair is scraping up against the mic, or they're wearing like a scarf, or they're wearing earrings, that tends to produce a lot of unfortunate noise. And it's not noise that people even think about because they usually use those, headphones for just like phone calls or whatever, but it can be really unfortunate when podcasting. So mainly it's just not letting your mic touch anything else and then trying to record in a quiet room with a lot of soft stuff.
Well, I think I've got a lot of soft furnishings in my room, so I think that should probably be okay.
Yeah, I mean, the soft things just don't make echoes, is really what it comes down to.
They don't make echoes?
Yeah, you don't want echoing around.
No echoing?
Yeah, echoing, because you want the mic to just pick up what you say the one time you say it. You don't want it to echo around the room and then get picked up again by the mic.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just joking.
Oh, I see what you're doing now. A little wordplay. Sorry, I was thinking audio, and you were coming at me with
it's totally fine. I threw you a loop.
Fancy writer words.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of. This is episode 294, and our theme this time is Owl Hallows Eve. I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science in just a moment is my new friend Asher, who's going to talk to us about his scientific reporting and how he got into journalism and folklore and mythology and some of the things we share in common having grown up in the South. So look forward to that discussion in just a moment. But before I get into that, if you live in the United States, you know that the midterm election is upon us, and I would just like to encourage all of our listeners to make sure they have a plan and intend to go and vote. There's been a lot of talk about how historic an election this promises to be, and I would encourage everyone not to let themselves be put on the sidelines of history if it indeed is as historic as we think it might be. I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but if there are candidates that maybe say that climate change is real and want to do something about it, which will probably be Democrats and less likely to be Republicans, I think voting for those, not that I would encourage anyone to be a single issue voter, but all other things being equal, from a scientific perspective, that to me is a very important issue. Obviously, other issues are important to me as well, and I factor those into my vote, but they generally all tend to trend in that same direction. So take with that what you will, and with that, we are going to dive into my conversation with Asher. Enjoy. All right, so I'm being joined by Asher Elbein, who promotes himself as a storyteller for hire based out of Austin, Texas, doing some science reporting, but also some comic book reporting, which is how I first became aware of his work and then had the pleasure of meeting up with at SVP. So, Asher, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
All right, so because we are a science show, and because at least the word science comes before the word sort of, I fully anticipate that we might get into the comic book realm, and especially because we're going to be promoting some work that you have coming up. But I want to start talking about your science reporting. So maybe to play on a comic book trope, do you want to tell us maybe your origin story of how you became, what were you bitten by a radioactive science reporter, or how did you first enter the world of science journalism?
So what happened was I spent a very productive childhood running around creeks in Dallas and Atlanta and harassing various local wildlife, mostly lizards and snakes, but on a couple of notable occasions, armadillos and skunks, and bringing them home and letting them roam around the house to my parents' deep consternation. And kind of along the way, I got incredibly interested in the natural world in all its various permutations. And one of the things that really interested me, and still really interests me, are dinosaurs and other sort of like prehistoric organisms, which led into a greater interest in prehistoric ecosystems and modern ecosystems. And so most of my sort of science background was all based around what you might call macrobiology. If you can't see it, if you don't need a microscope to see it, I'm probably really interested. If you do need a microscope, man, I try, but it's hard for me to give it as much attention as it probably deserves.
I have a similar line that I use, and I say that if I can't tackle it and hold it down, then I'm probably less interested in it than I would be.
So
for me, it's
not
a tackle
super
threshold.
interested. You're not super interested in elephants, then, is what I'm hearing.
Well, see, in my mind, that counts because I can at least try to tackle it, right? Because I mean, some of the ground sloths I work on were the mass of an elephant.
Sure.
So for me, it's an aspirational, but it has to. It's a lower threshold. Or anything too small to tackle, too small to be worth tackling, for me is less interesting.
Makes perfect sense to me, honestly.
It doesn't. I mean, it makes sense to you, but I'm sure everyone else is like, so Ryan thinks he could tackle an elephant.
Well,
I don't think I could. I think I could try.
I think you could tackle an elephant. I don't know that the elephant would consent to be tackled.
That's true. It's a conceptual tackling. It's not an actualized tackling. I always treat the animals I study with love and respect. I've never actually tackled anything that I've worked on. The only times I've even had to hold something down was because it was being sedated and we were waiting for the sedative to kick in. So
I did football tackle an armadillo when I was a kid.
Good thing you didn't get the plague.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Nobody told me that they carried leprosy.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Which I thought was a dereliction of duty.
Yeah, it's they definitely do carry leprosy. It's because their carapace is actually a heat sink, and so they have a lower body temperature than you would expect for a mammal that size. And apparently, the leprosy bacterium can use their lower body temperature as a refugia, and they are asymptomatic carriers of the leprosy bacterium.
They're delightful animals, though. One of the things that I love about living in Texas, and actually, I say living in Texas, but having just gone back to Georgia recently and seen some baby armadillos wandering around a forest, I love getting to be around these like deeply weird, like sort of prehistoric looking animals with their, whiffly noses and tiny little eyes. They're great.
Yes, I agree. They are highly adorable, and more Americans will get to appreciate them because their distribution is tightly controlled by the lowest temperature achieved during winter, and so as that number goes higher and higher, the distribution of armadillos has moved further and further north. So,
around the time that Texas declared independence, armadillos hadn't crossed over from Mexico yet.
I did not know that.
Yeah, they're really remarkable how recently they showed up in sort of the continental United States.
But once the armadillos learned that they would have independence in Texas, they were like, well, let's go there.
Yeah, you gotta get in on this train of sovereign nation states and all that.
Now, have you eaten one? Are they kosher?
Oh, aggressively not kosher. And also, I don't know if you were listening to our discussion, but they carry leprosy. I don't want that in my body.
Yeah, but I mean, chickens have salmonella.
That's true. That's a fair point.
You never enjoyed some matzah soup with some schmaltz?
Sometimes. So actually, I grew up vegetarian in my parents' house. So I didn't actually start eating meat until college, whereupon I ate quite a lot of meat, as you might imagine, and now I'm sort of like cutting back.
It deeply disappoints me that I can't buy schmaltz as a cooking fat in just like the grocery store. Like, it's not, I don't mind making it myself, but it would be so much easier if I could actually purchase it. Maybe there are parts of the world where that's a thing, but
New York would be my guess.
Yeah. But ever since I learned what it was, and I was like, oh, because that's just delicious all the time. Yeah, liquid gold.
But anyway, to get back slightly on topic,
I feel like we're gonna get back to food at least a couple of times. It seems to be a recurring theme with us.
Yeah, but my sort of joke about being a storyteller for hire is that when I was in high school, I went to a performing arts high school, but majored in creative writing, and really just loved writing short stories and telling stories in general and the process of narrative. But I also was sort of scoping out the short story markets, and like that is not any way to make a living. So I decided to do something that was much more lucrative: freelance journalism.
Did you do any performance art when you were in high school or since then? Like, has that ever been a part of your milieu?
Yeah, I was a theater kid.
Me too. That's why I asked. So.
And man, I loved that. But my theater teacher once said, if you can't imagine yourself doing anything but act, then you should act. And if you can imagine yourself doing anything else, then you shouldn't act. And I was like, oh, I can imagine myself doing all kinds of other things.
My dad said the same thing to me about becoming a physician.
Really?
Yep.
I don't feel like I normally hear it about being applied to physicians.
Well, my dad decided to go to med school after having had a career in the Air Force as an engineer. And so I think he had a different perspective than maybe a lot of younger folks who decide to pursue a career in medicine. And so he had seen that, like, oh, I'm really not going to be happy unless I do medicine.
Oh, I see. Well, that makes a lot of sense then.
Yeah.
Well, so in my case, the thing that it actually turned out I couldn't imagine not doing was writing. So I went to the University of Alabama, and they have an interdisciplinary.
Roll Tide, or can we just move past that?
I will accept a Roll Tide.
I mean, I don't really want to, but if it's
okay, well, in that case,
it's going to make things go more smoothly. I'll give you a Roll Tide.
Roll Tide, but I never went to a football game, so it's fine.
I mean, how did you avoid it for 4 or however many years you happen to be there?
Oh, it's easy, man. The stadium's huge. It's very easy to not step foot in it. Well, in this case, the interdisciplinary program called the New College, and the sort of like liberal arts interdisciplinary program minor, which is called Blunt, gave me a really good education and really a great opportunity to take a bunch of classes that having just a strict major wouldn't have allowed. And so I went into college thinking, okay, well, I'm going to be a science journalist because I like science. I like writing about science. I like writing about animals. And this seems like a way to potentially make a living doing something that I really enjoy. And I was lucky enough coming out of college to start placing stories in fairly national outlet. Almost, I don't want to say immediately because that makes it seem like it was easy, and it wasn't. But certainly within the first 3 or 4 months of being a freelance journalist, I'd placed a couple of stories in like sort of big Southern outlets, and then from there it was just keeping along. And I've been doing this for about 4 years now, and I'm making a living at it, which is no end of surprise to myself, I have to admit.
And so what do you attribute that to? Like, what is there something about your philosophy or how you approach these topics that you think has made it easier for you to, not easy, like you said, it's not easy, but has helped you become a person that editors want to work with and outlets want to publish?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. The first one is there's just discipline of just getting the work done and getting the work done on time and being communicative and fun to work with, which I attribute a lot of my success to. I think I'm a pretty good writer, but I think I think the real skill is getting stuff done in a timely fashion, turning in pretty clean copy that isn't like a pain in the ass for editors to work through. And then on top of that, if you can be good, that's great. And the other thing I think is really has helped me is that I don't think a lot of people are pitching sort of what an editor who I didn't work with very much sort of derisively called animal stories, but really what they are is natural history stories. So I did a piece recently for the Texas Observer about alligator gar, which are these really interesting taxa that is kind of all over Texas rivers and is a big part of sort of Texas folk life. And so the piece wasn't just like, hey, wow, here's this weird fish. It was also, and here's the conservation of this weird fish, and here's the way that this fish is sort of played into the state's history. And that's the kind of thing that I don't think many writers are sort of proposing. And so it sort of helped me carve out this niche where I can tell essentially stories or even almost like traditional magazine profiles, only the subject isn't a celebrity. It's an interesting animal or an interesting local park or some sort of very interesting scientific project that's happening and really do these sort of deep dives and more almost like treating them like they're short stories instead of these really quick newspaper pieces.
To me, the thing that I find distinguishes your science writing from other science writing that I read, and I read a lot of pop press science reporting to do this podcast, and it is usually well written. It is sometimes a little bit formulaic, and I usually read those stories before diving into the actual paper just because they're quicker and they're written to be quicker to read. So that's the reason for that. But I tend to find that a lot of it feels very journalistic in that, like, here, just the facts, ma'am. Whereas I found that some of your writing has more of like a David Attenborough feel of like I'm watching a nature show.
Oh, that's a huge compliment. That's very much something that I go for. I did a story. Oh, thank you. I did a story for the Bitter Southerner, which is a really awesome website that sort of like an online magazine that does these sort of progressive deep dive features about various aspects of Southern living. But
yeah, you were telling me about this and I got really excited.
Yeah, I'll tell your listeners, I'd done a couple of pieces for them. I'd done a piece on serpent handling that was my first published long form piece.
We talked about that a little bit at SCP just because that's something we both grew up interested in as animal lovers in the South. That's kind of this weird like I mean, you can explain serpent handling if you want, or I can try to take a crack out of it. I mean, we are on a science podcast, so we have to tread lightly somewhat, but please continue.
Yeah, I would just a quick diversion into serpent handling. What really fascinated me about it, and what it is that there's a sort of smaller subgroup of evangelical Christianity called the holiness people. And they believe that there's one of the ways that you demonstrate your faith in God is by performing what are essentially would be considered signs and miracles, like drinking poison or handling fire, or most famously taking up venomous snakes and sort of dancing with them or handling them as a symbol of their faith in God. And this is something that possibly was being practiced in the Appalachians prior to its sort of mainstream emergence, but really came to prominence in the early 1900s and was really popular for a while. And then a couple of people died and a bunch of states outlawed it. And now it does persist, but it's pretty rare. But I found it super interesting because one of the other things that I'm really interested in is sort of folk religion and weird, what we would call weird or non-mainstream religions. And I love snakes, so it was a really obvious topic. But I did this piece for the Bitter Southerner, and I did a couple of other pieces for them. And then I went to the editor, Chuck Reese, who's a complete sweetheart and great to work with. I was like, hey, can I write a piece about the Appalachian subcontinent in the Cretaceous and do it in the style of a David Attenborough documentary? And I didn't think he was going to say yes, but I showed him some of my art because I'm also a paleo artist, very much on my spare time. I'm not a professional. And they greenlit it. And so what I ended up producing was essentially a narration track and for a David Attenborough documentary that can never exist, complete with illustrations. And it is, to this day, one of my favorite pieces that I've ever done.
Oh, that's really cool. You have to send me a link for that so I can include it in the show notes.
Definitely.
And I believe there is also a one verse in the New Testament that mentions something about how the followers of Jesus will be immune from the venom of the serpent.
Yeah, they will take up serpents or something like that.
So yeah, I think that, like, what you're talking about, that 1900s emergence was also around when the first biblical literalists show up in the quote-unquote fossil record, if we're going to refer to, the paleontological, archaeological history of religion.
Sure.
So, like, biblical literalism wasn't really a thing until around then, so it kind of makes sense that, like, if you start taking the Bible literally, then you're going to start grabbing snakes.
And it comes out of the tent revival tradition too,
yes.
which was extremely theatrical and was extremely charismatic in both the technical sense and also the having been to a couple of serpent handling services. Those folks know how to put on a show, I gotta say.
So you actually went to the church?
Yeah, I went up to Macedonia, Alabama.
Did you participate?
Well, no, yes and no. So they did not handle serpents while I was there, which I think was very much
because you were there, you think? Or
I think so. They were very welcoming, but they're also fairly discreet. Because they are not well regarded in the mainstream and are generally pretty, I think I would say understandably suspicious of outsiders, because outsiders often come in and make fun of them.
Yeah.
But they did ask me to testify, which put me in an awkward position because I'm Jewish. And I was like, well, I'm not going to get up and praise Jesus. I'm just not going to do that. But I kind of thought on my feet and got up and gave I like to think a rather stirring address about, my God is the God of the rivers and streams who gives us a beautiful land that we have to cherish and and protect. And they went for it. They were just like, yeah, brother, like, yeah, we often don't talk about that aspect of the Lord our God, but he is bountiful. And I was like, yes. Oh, that was a close one.
Wow, that's wild. Well done. I don't know if I could have been that quick on my feet. That's really cool. Yeah, because I tried to go to a snake hunting church in high school and was stymied for, very legitimate reasons, but it was one of my adolescent, what's the word I'm looking for? Rebellions. One of my adolescent rebellions that I attempted. But I do remember that there's a weird paleo snake handling connection because the actor who played Tim
on Justified.
In Jurassic Park, played a snake handler on Justified, which I love. Justified is one of my favorite television shows of all time.
Can we talk about Justified a little bit? I love that show.
I insist. We must talk about Justified.
How did you feel about? We probably shouldn't talk about the ending, but
all right. Let's initiate the. I would say when people ask me what the premise of Justified is, because Justified is a show about. It's based off of what's the name of the author?
Oh, Elmore Leonard.
It's based off the Elmore Leonard character, Raylan Givens, who he wrote a bunch of novels about. And he is a deputy U.S. Marshal, Raylan Givens, from Eastern Kentucky. He gets sent back to Eastern Kentucky after being abroad and around other parts of the U.S. And he essentially has to become the lawman for, his very coal mine clan-based family and friends of the hollers of Eastern Kentucky. And other than the fact that it was so blatantly filmed in Southern California, I would say it is, in my opinion, the closest a television show has gotten to depicting sort of the area I grew up in Southern West Virginia.
It's an astonishing show for a lot of reasons, not least of which because it manages to have its sort of like holler gothic vibe of there's neo-Nazis and there's meth and there's, occasionally just all sorts of of sort of cartoonish villains. But it's also written so well and with such a beautiful attention to dialogue.
Yes.
And also
the characters aren't stupid.
Yeah. Well, okay, some of them are very stupid, but
yes,
in the best Elmore Leonard tradition. But the main characters are very smart. Indeed.
Well, I mean, yeah, Dewey Crow's an idiot, but he's an idiot that we all knew growing up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was gonna say Dewey is the hold my beer and watch this personified.
Totally, but Raylan is intelligent. Ava is intelligent. Tim is intelligent. Rachel's intelligent. Boyd Crowder's intelligent. All these Southern characters. In a way that is not typical for shows set in Appalachia or set in the South. It's that sort of thing of don't let the accent fool you. Everyone here knows the score.
Yeah, and so that actually I wouldn't have come to serpent handling if it weren't for Justified. And only came to Justified because this was in college, and the fourth season, which opens with a serpent handling church, was the season premiere of the fourth season was the first episode of Justified I ever saw, and I was instantly hooked. Pulled me in just immediately. And I had never really thought about serpent handling before. It was something that and there's some people who dance around with rattlesnakes, hadn't thought about it. And something about seeing it presented on screen, and actually there are elements of the way that Justified portrays serpent handling that are dramatically really cool, but are not super accurate, which I found out later, having, researched and reported on it. In Justified, the serpent handling ministry, which plays a sort of a minor role in season 4, which is a fantastic season of television in general. There's a young sort of charismatic preacher, and there's his sister who sort of follows him around, but we later learn is actually milking the serpents so that they can't envenomate him if they bite him. And this is a thing that people have said about serpent handlers forever, that they drug the snakes somehow, or they milk them, or they pull the teeth. And while that does occasionally happen, by and large, serpent handlers are really serious about handling serpents that could definitely kill them. Because if you think about it, it's a religious rite. It's the whole point is that you're placing yourself in God's hands, and to do so with a snake that has no fangs would be meaningless.
Yeah.
Still a fantastic couple of episodes, and a great season of television in basically what may be my favorite TV show of all time.
Yeah, it's definitely up there for me. I've been tempted to do a rewatch for a while now, and this conversation may just push me over the edge. Because, I mean, the show deals with, like, the opioid and heroin epidemic, the oxy epidemic, the moonshine culture, you know, just law enforcement in general, what the coal mine industry has done to that region of the country. Also, I would say that the barbecue joint up in Noble's Holler in season 3 primarily is one of the top fictional restaurants I'm sad I can't go to.
Yeah, that Limehouse looks like he cooks a mean barbecue joint.
Yeah. So I love that show. It's exciting. I don't get to talk about it very often. And, you know, my wife and I would just laugh every time they said, like, we got to go up the holler. And then it would cut to a scene of, like, golden grassy hills and Spanish oak.
I know.
And we're like, yeah,
that's
not
what
right.
That
looks like at all. Like, it'd be hard to, it's actually be hard to get an establishing shot in a holler just because they're such, you know, kind of tight and claustrophobic spaces tucked into the mountains. But
I got a real good friend who her aunt lives up a holler in Dahlonega, Georgia, and
I need to translate holler.
It's a yeah, let's do it. It's a sort of a narrow mountain valley. It's one of the things about Appalachian dialect is it tends to throw sounds on o sounds. So hollow becomes holler. So a hollow in the mountain is, oh, you know, that holler up there. And they tend to be like have water running through them. You know, at the bottom of the holler will be a creek or a crick.
A crick. Good Lord willing, and the creek don't rise.
Yeah, Lord. Yeah. So, but my good buddy Elise lives in.
And they tend to be controlled by like a small group.
Yeah,
like there's enough space for a family to live there.
Yeah, or if it's a particularly large holler, it'll be one or two families, and then, you know, the higher up in the holler you go, the worse the ground tends to be. So there's only so far up that people tend to live. Because
the whole Appalachian region was mostly settled by like Scots-Irish, it tends to be, you would refer to your family as your kin or your clan.
Yeah.
So when we say clan, we're not necessarily referring to the guys in the hoods, it's just the term for a close unit.
Yeah, the whole thing about Appalachians being clannish used to mean that they were just pretty inwardly focused and tribal. Yeah. And with the sort of like advent of the Ku Klux Klan, some parts of the mountains took that in a different and significantly worse direction.
Agreed. Yeah, so where were we? Snake handling, justified, clans, snakes.
Yeah, man,
we like snakes.
I could talk about snakes forever, but
in the deep dark hills of eastern Kentucky, that's the place where I traced my bloodline, and it's there I read on the hillside gravestone, you will never leave Holland alive. Oh, my grandfather's dead across the Cumberland Mountains. He took a pretty girl to be his bride. Said, won't you walk with me out of the mouth of this holler? We'll never leave a Harlan alive.
All right, well, it would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. Asher, I have heard from you that you are not much of a booze drinker, but, you know, as I explained, this segment can be about any sort of beverage that you enjoy. And so are you having anything that you want to tell the people about?
yeah, I'm having a bottle of water, which is part of a pack of bottled waters that I bought because Austin was under a boil water notice for about a week last week. So I'm just working through these before switching back to ice cubes and tap water.
Okay, yeah, we were under a boil advisory a couple of weeks ago ourselves, and I wasn't that concerned about it for where I was, but we were dog sitting a dog, and so I boiled water for the dog.
Sure.
And then just drank out of the tap myself like an animal.
gonna do that, and an editor that I work with a lot, who used to be a sort of a water reporter, was talking on social media. Is like, yeah, you can totally drink the water. It's like it's probably safe, and I was like, yeah, but I've been having, I've had enough health issues recently that getting some awful giardia or like brain amoeba is just it'll really cramp my workflow. So I'll get some bottled water. And
do you know what the water advisory was in regard to? I know in my neighborhood it was because there'd been a drop in pressure in the pipes, and so they were worried there might have been backflow that got into the supply.
For us, it was, we had actually, while we were at SVP, there was some really nasty flooding up in the upper parts of the hill country. In Llano, the river carried the bridge away, this bridge that had been there for like 40 or 50 years. And so the Colorado River, which provides most of the drinking water for Austin, was running just like hot chocolate color. And there was a bunch of grit. The stations were kind of like running massively behind and like clearing the water that was getting pumped in. And it was just, I think generally they said that like we can't guarantee if there's a lot of water usage that the water that will be coming in will have been treated. And having seen the Colorado River is a lovely river in many ways, but I would not care to drink water from it that had not been pretty extensively treated.
I find the Colorado River really kind of ends on a dud.
A little bit. There was I do have to say, there was a really neat picture that's going around, and it shouldn't be that hard to find, but there's one of the Austin creeks, Barton Creek, is mostly spring fed, coming out of Barton Springs. And so it's this beautiful, deep, clear green with sort of like white rocks on the bottom, and even where it's like 20 or 30 feet deep, you can see straight through on a good day. It's gorgeous. And where it outflows into Lady Bird Lake, which is the dammed up portions of the Colorado River that run through Austin. And when the Colorado was flooding and brown, Barton Springs was flowing out clear, and where they met was this really sharp divide where it was like clear green, clear green, clear green, and then just pitch mud and this like very thin swirly section where the two waterways joined. And it's a really dramatic picture. It's really worth Googling.
Yeah, I think people who don't think about how water works in the natural world assume that all water mixes together pretty evenly, but most of the times when rivers confluence, there's there's a gradient for a while, if not a very stark contrast. The one I remember learning about in school is where the Rio Negro meets the Amazon.
Mm-hmm. That was what I was thinking.
Yeah, so it's always surprising, I think, if you're not versed in that subject, but I'm glad you're keeping your water supply clean and that you will be healthy and ready to seize the day as they come. So that's important. And I will tell you about what I'm having. It has been a crazy month of travel for me. So as we discussed, we were hanging out in Albuquerque not but a week ago, or was it a week ago? I've lost track of that too.
Might have been.
No, it was almost 2 weeks ago at this point. Now that I think about it.
Oh, I guess that's right.
So I've been traveling a lot. I've been giving a lot of talks, and I was lucky enough to be invited up to Carlisle, Pennsylvania to give the seminar talk at the Earth Sciences Department of Dickinson College, invited by my friend Jordan, who we were in the department together at the University of Wyoming, and they took me to one of their local breweries, which is the Molly Pitcher Brewing Company. And it is named after a woman who fought in the Revolutionary War, who kind of settled in Carlisle after the war with her husband, and that's where she had her family and then died and interred. And the beer was really good, and they had one of those crowler systems. Are you familiar with these, Asher?
I'm not, no.
It's essentially, I'm going to open the can. So they build a can right there at the bar, basically. They've got this machine that they can fill like this aluminum tube with, and then the machine like screws down a can top with the pop top that you just heard me pop open. So it's like getting a growler of beer where they fill up a jar from the tap, but instead it's making a can from scratch, and it makes it so that because you're removing all oxygen from the system, it makes it last a lot longer off the tap line, and so you can save it for a little bit. So I've saved this one for like 2 weeks, and this is their main drag, which I believe is a double IPA. that I'm enjoying here as I talk to you.
What's the flavor like?
It is like a lot of double IPAs. It is clearly heavily hopped, but I find that when you have the double IPA, even though you're adding a lot more hops, you get kind of that dry, bitter finish. The initial flavor tends to be a little sweeter, and I don't know if that's from. It's probably from the increased alcohol, but I also feel like that gives the malts more of a chance to shine through, even though it does end in a very classic IPA dry, piney finish. But yeah, it's a very good beer, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to go and meet some of the students and faculty up at Dickinson, and had a fun time hanging out in Carlisle, and am enjoying the fact that I got to bring this beer back with me.
That sounds like a fun time.
Yeah. And with that, we're going to move over to our next segment, and we will see you. We're going to drag ourselves in a main way. We're going to mainly drag ourselves into our next segment, and that's coming up next. Actually, what I want to talk to you about is, so you sent me an article. You wrote an article about a early lung in birds that was found and described at SVP. Which
yeah.
I was very interested to talk to you about until I saw that you more recently published an article about the Mothman.
Oh yeah, let's talk about Mothman.
But you published both those articles for the same publication. You published them both for Audubon. So I was going to ask you, sort of like, you mentioned yourself that you write a lot for Audubon, and I think most people think of Audubon as maybe just a database where you look up birds, but what's Audubon about these days?
So Audubon has a magazine that I probably shouldn't say this, but I basically ignored it for most of my life because I liked birds but didn't have particularly strong feelings about them. And I'm noticing there's a theme here that I'll have these things that I seem like they would be within my purview, but it really takes something to kind of like flip the switch in my head and make me like really interested. And I came across this great story, and I wasn't sure quite where to send it. And I was kind of like casting around for new places to write. And I met this really remarkable woman named Lauren McGough, who is a falconer, and she flies a golden eagle, one of the few people to do so in the United States. And she's really just a remarkable woman. So I ended up profiling her for Audubon, which was a great time. And they said, if you ever have anything else bird related for us, you should pitch again. And I asked, well, what does bird related mean? And they said, well, if it's even remotely bird related, we are potentially interested in it. So I immediately, being me, pitched some, paravian stuff of like bird-like dinosaurs, kind of thinking that they'd say, we kind of just want living birds. But like, yeah, this seems bird-like. It's like, okay, all right, I think I can do business with you. So it's been really solid work, and I've gotten to kind of expand the remit of the stuff that I do for them. So I did a piece about the Greek myth of the sirens, and how sirens, which are typically thought of as being mermaids, are actually much more properly thought of as essentially like bird spirits,
like a
which
harpy?
Somewhat like a harpy, yeah, but where harpies are more of a punishment, sirens typically were depicted as being songbirds with the faces of women, and there are these really sort of interesting resonances with that because it ties into these funerary birds, which were often present in various like classical tombs, which birds are often thought of as psychopomps, which is to say they take the souls of the dead to the next world. So the sirens being birds, and they sing this, what is supposed to be a seductive song, but it's not a sensually seductive song. It's a seductive song of knowledge of the other side, of the names of pain, of glories of the past. And so what they represent in the Odyssey isn't, oh, hey, we're sexy fish ladies. It's, hey, Odysseus, come and listen to us, sing about the glories of Troy until your body falls apart and never go home. Never leave behind the things that you did.
Which makes more sense for Odysseus as a character.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because he was more of an intellectual than he was like a dude who wanted to get some ladies.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely does get a lot of ladies in the Odyssey, but not in this specific case. The sirens were not. That does not seem to have been the thing that made them was their sort of primary driver. And that
he's also the biggest nerd of all the heroes in the Trojan War. Like every other alpha male character in those stories is just like guts and glory, and he's like, hang on, let's think this through.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this was partially based on a new translation of, well, it's not that new now, but it's fairly new. This new translation of the Odyssey by Emily Wilson, who is the first woman to translate it. And she does this spectacular job of going back through the original Greek and translating not into really poetic language, but into this really stark, boiled down, sort of like beautifully clear, like diamond cut prose where a lot of times, for example, the opening of the Odyssey will be translated as something like, "Sing, O Muse, tell me the story of a man skilled in all ways of contending." And what Emily Wilson does with that, or variations on that, and what Emily Wilson does is, "Tell me about a complicated man."
Ooh.
Right? It's
that's
great.
Like way more. That's Elmore Leonard, right? That's like his writing. Or Cormac McCarthy, I guess, would be a better comparison to the writing style.
It is. It's a scalpel instead of a sword. It's incredible.
It's No Country for Old Trojans.
Yeah. No Country for Old Achaeans. It is. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And I just thought it would be.
That's exciting.
Terrible for me not to mention it.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Indeed. So yeah, less Wine Dark Sea, but it sounds like a worthy addition to the pantheon.
So, but anyway, I wrote this piece about the sirens, and I was thinking, okay, I love writing about folklore. It's one of my favorite things to write about when I can convince anyone to let me write about it. And I was thinking, okay, Halloween's coming up. I like to do, whenever possible, for the last 4 years, every Halloween, I've done a monster article of some kind. I did La Llorona, the Weeping Lady. I've done written about sort of Southern ghosts for the Bitter Southerner. And this time I was like, okay, well, Audubon is probably the quickest sell, so I need to think of a bird monster. And I just started thinking about owls and how owls just have this really spooky reputation. And I kind of pitched some ideas to my editor, and we went back and forth. And then I was like, well, okay, what if I wrote about how the Mothman is actually an owl? And she was like, yeah, that seems cool. You should write it. And I did.
Awesome. All right, well, let's get into the Mothman. I don't know that we've ever talked about the Mothman on the show. Longtime listeners to the podcast might remember that for a few years back, I helped out Brian Dunning as a guest host of Skeptoid, and I was very saddened that I could not cover the Mothman because he'd already covered it. I was able to do the Braxton County Monster. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one, Asher.
A little bit, but you should, for listeners who don't know.
It was an owl that scared some people. Which sets us up nicely for the Mothman.
Quite a lot like the Flatwoods Monster, actually.
This is Ryan breaking in to interject that I didn't hear Asher say the Flatwoods Monster while we were recording, but I noticed it while I was editing just now, and the Braxton County Monster and the Flatwoods Monster are the same thing. So, I know you were all probably already writing your angry letters to tell me that I missed that one, but I wanted to correct it here and now. All right, back to the show.
Or the Kelly County Goblins.
I grew up, the Kelly County Goblins is also a great one. I didn't learn about that one until I was an adult. So I grew up, I lived in Loveland for a little while growing up, and there's a cryptid from Loveland called the Loveland Frog, which I did an episode about for Skeptoid. And then I did Braxton County Monster, because that's about 60 miles from where I grew up. And then Point Pleasant's a little bit further away, but my dad worked across the river in Gallipolis, Ohio for a while. So he was driving over the river where the tragedy on the River Ohio occurred. And I think he and my mom actually went to the Mothman Festival in Point Pleasant one year. And I read the Mothman Prophecies growing up, and it was, it was as good as any ghost story I read set in Appalachia, and really informed my horror sensibilities in a important way. Especially Ingrid Cold, which isn't really a part of the owl narrative, but is a really creepy character in that mythology.
Mm-hmm.
But you wrote a feature for Audubon that just came out about, is the Mothman of West Virginia an owl? I think I'll go ahead and give a spoiler warning. Yes.
Absolutely.
So it's a creature that with glowing eyes and wings that it was
sort of an amorphous, like the head and the body sort of blend together or aren't differentiated at all.
Because it's not there, because you're just adding it in. You're adding a humanoid form to the body of an owl as it flies at you, basically.
And crucially, it flew silently.
Right.
That's one of the first things that the people that the first saw and described what came to be called the Mothman were like, oh yeah, we saw this thing on the ground and the eyes shone, not glowed, shone. That's a pretty important word.
Ooh, interesting.
Shone red in, the reflection of the car light. And we were like, they said I think understandably, were creeped out and drove away, and that they looked back and saw it following them, sort of like without its wings moving and just completely silently. And this just freaked them out so bad that they just drove kind of hell for leather out of the forest where they'd been driving.
Well, and to add context, they weren't driving, they were parking, right? These were teenagers up on the hill slope outside of town. So this Point Pleasant is like right on the Ohio River. So it's not in like holler territory. It's in like river valley territory with sloping hills of the Appalachian foothills kind of going up outside of town. And so there was this area that used to be a munitions plant in World War II. And that river valley in West Virginia, well, I guess not that river valley, but the Kanawha River Valley in West Virginia has a ton of chemical plants. And so there was always an idea that there was a lot of weird chemical development happening, and maybe that was part of this munitions development up on the hill outside of town. And so there was kind of a persistent local mythology that there were weird chemistry and experiments happening up outside town. So there was already a perception that things were weird up there and eerie and creepy and mutated and different, and the atomic age was upon us and all this other stuff. And so that was also the area where teenagers would go park and make out and do whatever else. And so, coupling the creepy new chemistry, new atomic age stuff with the heightened emotions that happen when teenagers are parking their cars to get away from parents and have a good time. Like it stands to reason that if anything startling happened, everything already being in kind of a heightened state would heighten everything further still. Is that fair, Asher, you think?
Very, very much so. And the other thing is that I think people don't realize how creepy owls can be if you run into one and you're not expecting it.
Well, especially because everyone thinks owls are just like, whoo. No, they scream. They're terrifying.
Yep. Some of them hiss. Barn owls. I talked to folks from the Ryan Barbour from the Barn Owl Project. I didn't get to use much of what he told me, but barn owls are, I think, particularly interesting. And I'll say the owl that Joe Nickel sort of like names as the most likely candidate is actually the barred owl, which refers to the sort of barring on the tail. They have these really dramatically red eyes when you flash a light on them, which you should not do. Don't go out like shining a flashlight on an owl. The owl won't appreciate it. But if you do happen to catch the reflection, it's really dramatic and they're pretty big. But barn owls, which of course are really sort of light colored, they have these really tan feathers. They are also really creepy.
Their face looks for anything like the mythology of the gray alien that has popped up since that same era.
Exactly like that. They've got those black eyes and these really sort of like a face that's sort of human shaped, but not quite in this really.
What's crazy is if you see their skull, that shape, the shape of their face is all plumage. Like their skull is not really shaped like that.
Yeah. And they really, really like old buildings. So they like old buildings. They like abandoned buildings. They like buildings that you'd look at and be like, yeah, that building's haunted. And there's a decent chance, if you're out in a rural area and the population's healthy, that it is haunted. It's just haunted by a barn owl that's making creepy clicking and hissing noises.
Mm-hmm.
So Joe Nickel says, and I'm sort of inclined to agree with him on this, especially because I heard this from a lot of other ornithologists that I talked to, that there's a decent reason to think that a lot of ghost stories, not all, and I don't want to fall into the trap of saying like, oh, everything that we talk about or tell stories about like comes from a real thing. But barn owls do seem like a pretty good candidate for something that has just sort of been freaking people out for most of our history. And what seems to have happened with the Mothman is that in the initial stories, the Mothman is often referred to as a bird. There's some confusion about what sort of bird it is. It's often... Sorry, go on.
It also people often describe it as having more like bat-like wings, but it got called Mothman because Batman was already a thing. So like there's a weird pop culture, you and I are both comic book fans, but like there's a weird pop cultural reason it couldn't be called the Batman and end up getting called Mothman instead.
and then of course people start illustrating it to look more insectoid because it's called Mothman. Obviously it looks like a moth. Well, not so as you'd notice. But there was one ornithologist whose name was Dr. Robert Smith, who was, I guess some reporters called him up and were like, well, what do you think this is? And he said, oh, red eyes. I guess it's a sandhill crane because they have red markings around their eyes, which just completely blows past the fact that sandhill cranes generally don't show up in West Virginia very much. And also Mothman doesn't have a neck, sort of famous for not having a neck. And cranes are like all neck practically.
Yeah, and Braxton County Monster is similar in that it had glowing or shining eyes, and it had an onion-shaped head, and they said that it had it was 8 to 10 feet tall, but hovered off the ground, and had clawed hands that were reaching out at them. And I'm just like, so it's 8 to 10 feet tall, or a very small bird that's flying at you, and you perceive that there's a body underneath the rest of where you think the hands are.
And to be fair, if an owl were flying at me, talons outstretched, I definitely would fixate on talons and eyes and wouldn't pay too much attention to the rest of the body.
No, I'm not trying to discount... whenever I talk about this kind of stuff, I always try to clarify I'm not discounting anyone's lived-in experience.
Absolutely not.
It's just... I think, it's the same thing we deal with in paleontology. We're trying to deal with parsimony. What is the most likely or simplest? What is the explanation that introduces the fewest new factors? Occam's razor, I guess, is another idea behind that. And so the idea of being already in kind of a freaked out place because it's October and you're hiking up in the mountains to try to find a crashed UFO and an owl flies at you and you think it's an alien. Is it more parsimonious to say it was actually an alien, or were you psychologically in a state where you were willing to believe that an owl that you hadn't seen before was something else?
And I think too, there's something that I sort of touch on this at the end of the article, but I think that there's something, I understand why people who really like Mothman would be annoyed that someone would say, oh, Mothman's just an owl. But I don't think of it as just an owl, I think that there's something really compelling about the fact that we have animals that are, when you try and tell people about them, you sound like you're describing a monster. If it's essentially, we've got a type of dinosaur that has evolved through plumage, a flat face, completely silent flight, which is really remarkable if you think about it. Mm-hmm. And they, barred owls in general are really interesting and sort of territorial animals. And they are basically goblins or shape-shifting witches or spirits.
You're just saying goblins to bring in that Kentucky story again.
Yeah, well, that one's great because it seems like a pair of horned owls just really scared the piss out of some folks. But I don't say that in a dismissive way. These are actually quite frightening animals if you run into them unexpectedly. And I think that makes me like owls more, to be completely honest.
For me, it's also... if you read the book, The Mothman Prophecies, which if you just ignore that it's theoretically real, I don't really buy the realness of it, but if you just read it as a good horror yarn, it is incredibly creepy and very little of it has to do with the actual Mothman.
Yeah, there's a lot of work done around the sort of UFOlogy side of it and the kind of the actual prophecy, which was of course a bridge collapse, which unfortunately killed a lot of people.
The prophecy was a tragedy on the River Ohio, which they thought was going to be a chemical spill or a nuclear plant meltdown. But it ended up being this bridge collapse, which happened right around... in the movie, it's depicted as on Christmas Eve, but it actually happened, I think, a few days earlier. But there were literally Christmas presents, wrapped Christmas presents floating down the river amongst the bodies. It was truly horrific.
Yes.
No discounting for the tragedy and the horror of that. And the Mothman was spotted in proximity to the bridge right before everything happened. But like all the prophecy stuff and all the people like dealing with the alien encounters and a lot of the original Men in Black mythology comes from this period in this area. You know, like the earliest Men in Black are showing up in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And it's a very small town. Like it is not a hub of anything. No offense, Point Pleasant listeners, but it's a really fascinating glimpse into, I think more than anything, what like the Cold War mindset was.
Yeah, sure.
And that paranoia that just, you didn't know where the threat might be.
I think we would not get a Mothman today in the same way.
Not in the same way, but he has been spotted in Chicago this year.
I did see that.
Okay,
yeah.
you saw it. All right. I don't want to get into that because it's
moved up to the big city.
It's dumb. I don't like it. Keep it in Appalachia. But there have been people reporting a Mothman-like creature in Chicago.
You don't think Mothman could be part of the Appalachian diaspora?
I mean, I am. So I guess that's something Mothman and I have in common.
Sure. Mothman rules, though. Like, I get really interested in practically everything that I write about. And I always liked Mothman, but writing about this makes me really like Mothman a whole lot more.
Have you ever actually been to Point Pleasant?
I have not.
Okay.
I like to get out and report things on the ground when possible, but this was just a quick Halloween piece, so I didn't get the chance. But next time I'm up in the Appalachians, I'm planning on doing a big West Virginia road trip.
Well, please get in touch, and if we can make it coincide, I still haven't. My parents have been, but I have not gotten to go to the Mothman Festival, so I would like to go to that, and I will. I can take you to Braxton County. We can do the Braxton County Monster thing.
Just a tour of all the creepy owls of the Southern Appalachians.
Well, there's also there's so much creepy stuff in that region. Like I know it's not associated with any cryptid, but there's like the Trans-Allegheny Insane Asylum, which is
I don't know about this.
It's a giant campus that served as, old school lunatic asylum. And I know that word is not appropriate, but that's the word, I'm using the words in the era where this thing was established. And then there's also the Moundsville prison, like a prison built right next to an Indian burial mound. So the creepiness factor of things I could show you in West Virginia is endless. And I love it up there. So I'd be happy to show you around if you're in the area.
Honestly, I'll probably take you up on that at some point.
No, please do. Please do. Yeah, just look up Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Like the first photo that comes up on Google Images looks like something Stanley Kubrick would have used as an establishing shot for The Shining.
I'm looking at this right now because I can't resist. Wow.
Yeah. But it is in the middle of nowhere.
Really something. Yeah, you guys have to Google this. This is incredible.
Yeah. I'll include a link in the show notes. So yeah, there's there's some good stuff to be had, and then we can, eat pepperoni rolls and pull up the microphone and record something.
Well, probably not pepperoni rolls, but
my mom's got someone who makes vegetarian pepperoni rolls with black
vegetarian
beans,
all right.
Yeah. So we'll get you some of those, and you'll be good to go.
Why didn't you say so?
Because we're playing it fast and loose here.
Sure sure thing.
All right, so we're gonna maybe sort of start wrapping things up, and I guess before we do that, in addition to all of your science reporting, as I have mentioned a couple of times, you and I are both big comic book nerds. You do reporting on comic book culture, which is, equal parts a fantastic wonderland of people supporting each other.
And a garbage fire.
And a garbage fire of just some of the worst people who should not be allowed to have internet access, in my opinion. But instead of getting into that whole mess, this probably isn't the right show to talk about Comicsgate, but I would say your articles are on the right side of that. So if people want to read about Comicsgate, but honestly, it's one of those things, like if you don't know what Comicsgate is already listening to this, don't look it up. It's not worth your time.
It will not make you happier to know.
If you need to know, Asher's articles, right side of history, it's clear enough, and I think everyone who listens to this show who hasn't been turned off by me will agree. But instead, I want to talk about the not just the reporting you do, but the actual content you produce, which isn't necessarily comic, but is graphic and literative in nature. So can you tell us about Anna O'Brien?
Yeah, I'd love to. So we've been talking a lot about sort of like Appalachian folk tradition
Yeah,
and
that
Appalachian
might have been a better
spookiness.
transition than
That's
me.
fine.
That's fine.
But I thought I might pivot into it, but I didn't want to step on your toes.
No,
But,
you should have. You should have stepped on my owl talons. I was grasping the rotting beam of the barn and failed to see the obvious connection, but...
Ooh. To see with that kind of stuff, maybe you should be writing.
I try.
Yeah. So I did not grow up in Appalachia, but I grew up for quite a long time in Atlanta, Georgia, which is pretty close to the North Georgia mountains, which are the Appalachian, the sort of like lowest extent of the Appalachians,
Sure.
or the southernmost extent.
It's the end of the Appalachian Trail, right?
Yeah, the end of the Appalachian Trail. So I grew up really interested in Appalachian folklore, Appalachian sort of the various Appalachian horrors of ghosts and hags and haints and
haints. That's another very low country Southern Appalachian word.
Ain't that a great word? I love that word.
Great word. That's why you paint your porch blue.
Paint blue, yeah, because the ghosts don't like it. They don't stick around.
Yeah, apparently ghosts are less likely to cross the threshold into your house if you paint your porch blue. Or your threshold blue. Which is almost like it's a kind of it feels very Passover-y.
It is, I never made that connection before, and it's interesting. Man, it's so easy to dive into this tangent, but I'll at least dip my toe into it. One of the things about haint lore is that one of the things that really annoys or bothers or dispels ghosts is salt, because salt is something that is, salt preserves meat, salt is a scourer, salt is clean. And this is something that actually, if you go back to look at in the Torah, there's a couple of mentions of salt in this capacity. So it's a very old idea. And it's something that you can find in a lot of folk tales around ghosts in the sort of like low country and the Appalachian foothills and in Appalachia proper.
So are you suggesting that like the salt in the blood of the lamb's blood that they were painting on the threshold was a factor there? Because blood is salty. Like, blood is basically seawater.
Not in this case, but okay. I actually would be interested to see someone make that argument, because I'm not averse to it. I personally wouldn't be willing to make that argument.
Because I often think about how, like, iron is anathema to a lot of mythic creatures, fairies in particular, but, like, a lot of things, elves are often said to, like, be adverse to iron.
Cold iron. And
I've thought about that in a similar way. So like salt is interesting because salt is one of the few minerals that we need to eat to live.
Oh, yeah.
Because I remember when I was in college, I went to college in Santa Cruz, and Santa Cruz is kind of a haven for similar to Austin, some maybe food woo. And I remember seeing organic salt and laughing my head off because salt is not an organic molecule. So it is not possible to have organic salt. Like that is it's just an impossible term.
Just not a thing. But they were selling it because you can get away with labeling it because our labeling system is insane. And so, so I wonder if like part of that mythic role that salt plays is because it's this inorganic mined, we mine it from the ground and then we eat it. Yeah, there is definitely something deeply weird about the human relationship with salt. I would definitely say that.
Which, salt was the economic mineral of Southern Appalachia prior to coal, which not a lot of people know about. But like the Kanawha Valley where I grew up was a salt hub prior to coal becoming a thing. But I think about iron, and iron's position on the periodic table is it's that pivot point between where it's the heaviest element that stars can produce without going nova or supernova.
Really?
So isotopes, like radioactive isotopes heavier than iron, tend to decay back down to like an iron-like state. And so it's this weird pivot point on the periodic table where I know this is, a person who actually studies this stuff will correct me and say that I'm misstating it, but it is the stablest element. Like it is the most stable atomic element. And so I often wondered if like, is this association with the chaotic magic of elves and fairies, is iron anathema to them because it's so like stable and uncorruptible?
That's a really neat idea.
Yeah, so I've pitched it to comic book friends of mine, and they're all like, it's an interesting idea, but I've got no story to tell with it. So thanks, Ryan. But
well, I don't know. Maybe I'll keep it in mind. For
yeah,
a story.
Please do.
which is a neat pivot back to. So I was writing these stories in high school, and I had this idea. For, I'll write a story about like a mountain man who will sort of like wander around and solve ghosts. And I was just trying. I just kept hammering away at it, and it just didn't work. I couldn't figure out a way in. And I just remember having this like thought, just like a bolt from the blue, that was like, what if they were a woman? And that was really where this character of Anna O'Brien came from. That she's this wandering witch. She's had some sort of like very foundational spooky experiences that have left her with one wooden leg, and she wanders around the southern Appalachians, sort of meeting and dealing with all of these sort of spooky adventures. And so she runs across Cherokee spirits and sort of the risen dead, and a couple of your standard like Appalachian monsters, and like a lot of ghosts. And I worked on these stories off and on for years, and just never quite had time to do anything with them. A couple of them were published, but I always really liked collections of short stories, and I really wanted to make one of my own. And so I ended up chatting with an internet acquaintance, Tiffany Terrell, who does these incredible spooky illustrations. And we just sort of started batting around the idea of doing a book together. And what we ended up producing is Anna O'Brien Ghost Days, which is a collection of my Anna O'Brien short stories. It is fully illustrated by Tiffany Terrell, and she's just can't say enough great stuff about her. She's a wonderful person and just an incredible illustrator.
Her stuff reminds me a lot of Emily Carroll, who did Through the Woods.
Yeah, very similar. Terrell strikes me as someone who like took a sketchbook to a witch's Sabbath and just drew what she saw.
Yeah.
Like it's got this really neat sort of, she has a background in creature design, and you can really tell because her monsters and her spirits have, in addition to just like incredible sort of atmospheric energy, they look like something that would be alive.
Well, I would say that the style, having talked about comics a lot on like iFanboy and stuff, I would say that the style is scratchy, except that it's so clean.
Yeah.
So there's like, there's a scratchy realness to it, like the charcoal drawing style, but every line is so clean and crisp,
so considered,
that that's an improper way to describe it, but it evokes that while still being crisp and textured and awesome. It's
sketchy. I use this term sketchbook advisedly, but they have the energy and the sort of like looseness of sketches, but the pencil work is really tight.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think so we decided to do a Kickstarter for it, and we actually made our initial goal in the first day, which blew my mind. Like, I was not expecting that, and I'm super grateful to everybody who gave.
I could tell you weren't expecting that based on how excited you were to come on our show.
I mean, I'm still very excited, because I really enjoyed meeting you at SVP.
Yeah, no, I had a lot of fun talking to you too, but it was like, I was ready to like be on board as promotional, and then, as soon as we were back from SVP, I checked on the progress, and I was like, oh, he blew past his goal already. I mean, we will still talk and promote the book, and everyone should go talk about it, and we actually talked about the difficulties that come with promoting a Kickstarter that's already quote unquote succeeded. But yeah, I was very pleased to see that it crossed the threshold so quickly.
So one of the things that we're shooting for now is so we've hit our goal, which means that we're going to be making ebooks available, and there's a ton of really cool rewards still open if you want them, including the opportunity to commission Tiffany and get some of the original art from the book, which if I weren't running the Kickstarter, I definitely would have chipped in there because her work is so good. But one of the things that we're shooting for now as a stretch goal is if we hit $12,500, then Tiffany's going to do 5 more pieces of art for the book, which I really want to see because a bunch of the longer stories she picked cool scenes to illustrate, but there's other cool stuff I want to see her draw. So my personal appeal to you guys is please go out and back this because I want to see her do more art for this thing.
There's about a week and a half left on the Kickstarter right now as of when this episode will come out. So you Asher, now know that it comes out on Thursday. But yeah, so there's about a week and a half left for the Kickstarter for people to go and contribute, and it's we've had Zach Wienersmith on the show before, and he's done a lot of Kickstarter books, and it's similar to that in that like there are a lot of levels that pretty much anyone could support, and you'll get the ebook, and then there are higher levels where you get various levels of actual printed books and a lot of other things on top of that. So, there's something for everyone, and I'm very excited about it. Reminds me a lot, just other than like the narrative through line that you're clearly pushing with this character, it reminds me of a book that I loved as a kid called The Telltale Lilac Bush. Are you familiar with this?
I am not familiar with it. Tell me all about it.
It is a collection of Appalachian ghost stories, but it is folkloric in that the author just went around asking people in, the coal mining region of Appalachia for their ghost stories.
Yeah, one of the things that I really liked about this project is, like I said, I'm super interested in folklore and I read all about it just for fun. But I got to dig really deeply into Appalachian folklore, which requires running around and digging up as many books as you can because there are no good, solid, like sort of regional compendiums. They're all like pretty hyper local. But I also got a chance to dig into some of the Appalachian history that's not super well known. So I made a lot of use of this book called Ramp Hollow by Stephen Stoll, which I really can't recommend highly enough. And he sort of tracks this history of sort of the ways in which the frontier people of Appalachia became sort of pathologized and described as hillbillies and stupid and lazy and just basically unfit for civilization, which of course made it very easy for the timber barons and the coal mining barons to come in and say, well, you're not really using this land to its greatest potential.
Yeah,
and
people forget about the
off.
timber. The Appalachians were exploited above and below ground. Like the trees were cut just as fast as the coal was mined. And the timber companies were just as vicious as the coal companies.
There's a great quote, and I forget the name of the man who said it, but there's a timber man who's quoted in Ramp Hollow who says, "Our business is to get in, cut down everything, and get out. This is not a long-term industry." Like the term pillaging is really the only appropriate one.
And that's when I try to explain like what it's like to be from this area, I just try to say that it's a West Virginia, the state. I know Appalachia is bigger than West Virginia, but like West Virginia is a state that has had to deal with like continuous exploitation by people who had no interest in actually contributing anything back.
It is one of the few parts of the United States that is treated as a pure extractive economy in the way that a lot of what we traditionally called third world countries are treated. And I do not say that to insult the people of Appalachia at all. It's more it's just, if you look at the history, traditionally the history is these outside corporations will come in and they will steal everything that's not nailed down. And then they'll give an interview to a newspaper on the way out about, these poor backward people they're so poor. And man, if they could only just learn to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make something of themselves and just join the American dream. And I got it, like reading Ramp Hollow just like sent me through the roof so many times, but it's wonderfully well written, incredibly clear and concise and damning. And it was a major influence on this project.
We should point out that ramps are a traditionally foraged allium from Appalachia, specifically West Virginia. Just to like insult to injury, I was in San Francisco last year and I saw the Whole Foods was selling West Virginia sourced ramps for $20 a pound. So even the ramps that were traditionally foraged have now become an extractive economic thing that people, that is being, hopefully at least the money is going to someone who actually foraged them in West Virginia, and it's not the same as the giant corporate coal mines and timber mills, but it just keeps happening.
Man, we can only hope, right? I sort of joke sometimes when I'm talking about the book, and this is, you can tell how much this means to me because this is probably not a great way to sell it, but the book has a lot of monsters in it, but the real monster is capitalism.
I like that. I mean, if I had to take West Virginia history multiple times growing up there. The history focus would shift year to year. And I mean, when I learned about the coal mine wars and the fact that like coal miners literally went to war against Pinkertons just for the right to unionize and to be paid money, which like you might be listening to this and be like, what do you mean paid money? I mean, they were not paid money.
Paid money. Yeah.
Yeah. They were paid company script that could only be spent in the company store. So the company was basically paying them to spend money back to the company. So they had to fight and kill and die for the right just to be paid a wage.
And these are aspects of Appalachian history that are not the what we call labor violence, but really the sort of the wars of extraction in Appalachia and the wars for living wages and sort of not crippling work days is not something that explicitly happens in Anna O'Brien Ghost Days, although I do plan on writing stories about that. Anna O'Brien Ghost Days takes place in this period where the timber industry is really the one that is making strides in North Carolina and Tennessee. You know, this woman who's sort of like wandering through the forest is coming across more and more hillsides that have just been cut bare. And one of the things that that's doing in these stories is that it's not just sort of people that are getting dispossessed, it's also waking up all of these sort of older natural presences in much the same way that, you know, cutting down a mangrove forest means the tigers go into the slums.
Ooh, that's a great analogy. I like that. Okay, cool. So hopefully people are intrigued enough to go check out the Kickstarter. I will post a link to it in the show notes for this episode. And by the time you hear it, you're not going to have a ton of time to go and support it. So do not hesitate if this sounds interesting to you. Asher, I feel like we could keep talking for hours, but you know, I only asked for so much of your time this evening, so I want to let you go at a reasonable hour. And so what else do you want to tell people about where you're at in the world, or how they can get in touch with you and keep track of what you're working on?
Yeah. So I have a website. It is asherelbein.com, which is ASHERELB as in boy, EIN.com. You can also follow me on Twitter if you have a mind. I mostly tweet about journalism. There's a little bit of politics. There's a lot of snakes, and there's a little bit of socialism. So if you're not into that, you have been warned, but you can follow me on Twitter at Asher_Elbein.
I can name at least one now completely dejected comic book artist who is not into that, and that guy can go screw.
Well, that dude, I've had encounters with him before, and he can go f*** himself. Yeah. But yeah, and other than that, you can find me in the New York Times science section sometimes, and just follow me on Twitter, and I post all my work there, and hopefully onward and upward to even cooler things.
Well, that sounds great, man. And I hope, we know that Anna O'Brien is going to happen because the Kickstarter was successful. So I hope once it comes out and, you've had the chance to publish a few more things for your various outlets, you will come back and tell us how everything is going and just become, a friend of the show. So.
I'd love to. I had an absolute blast.
Well, it was my pleasure talking to you, and I'm looking forward to our Appalachian horror road trip, which I feel like we need to get a network involved in somehow. Because how is that not a show? But
oh my God, what a buddy comedy!
Yeah, so I think we have a lot in common, but enough of a different perspective that we could have a lot of fun with that. And just thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me.
To them goes to write history books. All them goes to write songs. Now everyone asks, would you write one about me? To them goes in the train yard. All them goes in my drink. Your money's no good here, just write one about me. And when you go where the winds are strong, when you go where
The PaleoPOWs, the portion of the show where we end things by thanking those who have made doing the show possible. And since it's just me riding solo today, I won't be doing a patron thesis, but I have come to notice that we actually didn't finish thanking everyone who was a PayPal donor before transitioning over to the Patreon system. So I want to make sure I make up for some of those people who may have felt skipped or left out. That's not good. So let's fix that one by one by first thanking Denise C for her recurring donation. Thank you, Denise. We really appreciated the support over the time the donation was active. And I'm taking a page out of my parents' playbook when they tell me that it is never too late to say thank you, or more specifically send a thank you card, which I'm historically terrible at. So Denise, consider this your overdue, but still very much heartfelt thank you for your support of the show. All right, I have a little bit more SVP-themed content coming up next episode, so look forward to that. And I don't think I actually have anything to plug. I think October was crazy for me, and now things are still happening in November, but winding down slightly. I've developed and been giving this how-to podcast workshop. And so I guess one thing I'll toss out there is I would love to hear from our listeners and see which of you are interested in podcasting, and if there are resources that maybe we can provide or put together some sort of online version of. Is that something people would appreciate and get something out of? So if you are interested in podcasting and would like to learn more about that from someone like me who's been doing it for nearly 10 years, please get in touch. I would love to just kind of gauge interest here and see what's going on in that space. So with that, I think we are all about out of stuff to talk about today. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll go check out the show notes to find all the links to the things we talked about. And with that, we'll see you next time for a whole lot more science. And then for the first time, I remembered to have a guest say...
Sort of.
Perfect. Thank you.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
Maybe something I should have said on the air, but it just occurred to me. One of the things I like about writing about things at the intersection of science and culture is that I love the process of science, and I love the sort of like scientific methodology and its iterative nature. But one thing I also really like is I like the way that science crashes into these other ways of knowing. And so writing about folklore is really interesting because you end up with these things that maybe don't materially exist. Like, I don't personally believe that ghosts exist in a way that could ever be measured or in a way that is materially real. Like, ghosts aren't real as far as I'm concerned. But if people believe that they're real and treat haunted houses as if they're haunted, then ghosts do in a real sense, I think, exist, because they affect the way they interact with and affect the way that people engage with the world. And so that's what's so fascinating to me about stuff like Mothman or La Llorona or Santa Muerte, the Saint of Death, in sort of like Mexican folk Catholicism, is that these things are, not to get too Neil Gaiman about like, the stories we tell are alive, but they do have a lot of power that in the way that talking about serpent handlers, it's so easy to laugh at them and say, oh, well, you pick up a rattlesnake, what do you think is going to happen to you? But it's not that they don't know, it's that they accept that and they find a sort of non-material narrative or spiritual power in it. And those sorts of intersections just absolutely fascinate me.
Sounds like we got our topic for the next time you come on then.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that.